Hello and welcome to No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Well, it has been quite a week in terms of the pursuit of peace for Ukraine. First, the summit in Alaska, then European leaders and President Zelenskyy flying to Washington to actually talk about, I don't know, the quiet part out loud, that there will have to be land swaps and there will have to be security guarantees if any of this is going to work. A complicated but key step, I think, is how we will put it. We'll be cautiously optimistic, a faint sense of hope. We are turning, of course, to Marcus Kolga, who is the founder of Disinfo Watch, watching all of the events in Russia, in Eastern Europe. He's also a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and we always go to him when weeks like this week happen. So let's just start. Where are you sitting on the bullish versus bearish scale of can any of this work?
I don't know. It feels like every time Donald Trump says anything publicly, I mean, there's just a flip and a flop back and forth, and it's hard to sort of track the actual direction that he's hoping to take. I'll say that before the summit in Alaska, I wasn't all that hopeful that too much would come out of it, but I had this faint optimism given the way that the meeting between Trump's envoy to Russia, Steve Witkoff, the way that his meeting went with Vladimir Putin in Moscow, exactly a week before. Not much came out of that meeting, which was also to be expected. There were some communiques that were put out by both the White House and the Kremlin, basically saying that each side there were signals made and acknowledged. So no reason for real optimism there. But what made me a bit more optimistic was that half an hour after that meeting with Putin and Witkoff ended, Donald Trump announced that he was placing secondary sanctions, secondary tariffs on India, 25% tariffs on India for its purchases of Russian oil. Now, why that's important is because India, along with China and Turkey, is one of the largest importers of Russian oil in the world. And the revenues...
the war machine funded and afloat.
Well, precisely. This is the lifeline that keeps Vladimir Putin's war-making abilities afloat. Yeah. He requires that money to continue, building these drones and missiles that are raining down now monthly in the thousands on Ukrainian civilian targets, and so just after 24 hours after Trump made this announcement, India and its government announced that it was placing a moratorium on the purchase of all Russian oil and gas. Yeah. This would have sent...
It's working. That's what I mean. These things are actually it's such a slow process, but...
Well, it was quite quick, 24 hours. This was 24 hours. It had an impact. Overall, yes. I mean, it's unfortunate that it took that long, but that would have set off a panic inside the Kremlin. And so I was optimistic that Donald Trump was actually coming to the realization that it was no longer the 1980s. It's now 2025. The U.S. could have the upper hand, and this could really make an impact in terms of ending this war by putting on this sort of pressure onto the Kremlin and onto Putin, because I think that Putin reacted to that. But that didn't seem to be the case when the red carpet was rolled out in Anchorage. The comments that were made afterward, it felt like Donald Trump had really acquiesced to Putin's demand. Was intentionally.
Let's get into this because there are two theories of the case, right? That the one you're laying out, which is Donald Trump is kind of a clumsy, foreign policy guy, and he loves to have the meeting. And if somebody tells him it's all great and says, if Putin says, "Hey, you're a wonderful guy," that changes the tenor. But I found interesting in the meeting with the Europeans, and they said it publicly and the body language kind of said it privately, which is regardless of what they think of Donald Trump, nobody else could have made this happen to bring everybody together. And now they're on their own path, right? I mean, the European leaders have been talking about all these issues amongst themselves, but they kind of needed him to convene the meeting. Now he has. Now the process will unfold either which way, and that let's not waste our time talking about whether we love or hate Donald Trump. Let's see
Yeah.
what we can get right now that the table has been laid.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think there was a realization amongst those European leaders, and there has been for quite some time, that Donald Trump is someone that they're going to have to deal with, love him or hate him, for the next 4 years.
Yeah.
He is the president of the United States, and I think that yesterday's meeting in Washington reflected that understanding.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. I think that those European leaders, and the one positive thing that came out of this entire meeting yesterday and this process over the past number of days, is that Europe is clearly more united than ever.
Yeah.
The fact that these
And
European
with
leaders,
America, actually, that seemed genuine, that there has been a huge rapprochement there, right?
yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay.
What was happening behind closed doors. We're not completely sure of what these European leaders are necessarily saying amongst themselves. I'm
Yeah.
sure they're all very much concerned. The fact that they all dropped whatever they were doing at the
Exactly.
drop, basically at the drop of a hat, rushed to
Yeah.
Washington with Zelensky, demonstrated that, number one, that I do believe that they respect the United States and the position it has and the office of the president. But I think that they were also concerned about the direction that Donald Trump was taking, certainly after the remarks in Anchorage. So again, I think that the one positive thing that we can take out of all this is the fact that Europe is united, probably more than ever, standing up in support of Ukraine. And that sent, I think, a very strong signal, not just to Donald Trump, but to the American people as well.
But Donald Trump also said, I mean, there will not be American boots on the ground. I think he made that pretty clear. But he also, I mean, this is my interpretation, for the first time, basically said, we're in, we're all in this together, Europe and the United States. They may be, having other kinds of military support, in terms of intelligence or air cover or whatever it is. But that Europe can't do this without American money and American equipment, even though they're required to spend a lot of it on American armaments, but that they need them at the table and participating.
Yeah, and that's absolutely fine. I mean, I think the Europeans all are very clear that they would be more than happy to buy U.S. equipment,
Right.
and for themselves, and to deliver it to Ukraine.
Yeah.
But without the U.S. really at the table, without U.S. Boots on the ground, I think that Donald Trump is also diminishing America's role in this entire process, and that's perfectly fine to hand over that sort of the role and the leadership to the Europeans. But I think that it's in the U.S. interests to be part of that as well. So,
Right.
declaring that they wouldn't have boots on the ground, I'm not sure how that really, quite frankly, helps anyone, including the United States.
Well, I mean, it's not, I don't know. I'm just reading this. I spent the last 36 hours, I'm just trying to sort through it too. But he can't, for obvious political reasons, enter a war, given what he has campaigned on and what his supporters believe in. But without U.S. equipment and intelligence, none of this could happen anyway. And things like air cover, and giving the Europeans permission to use the equipment, and Ukraine permission to use the equipment as they see fit. Unlike the previous administration, who said there had to be constraints on
Good point.
how they use that equipment.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They did have those constraints placed on how they use that equipment, and as long as there are no constraints on how Ukraine decides to use these weapons that are purchased by the European Union, I think that is progress that has been made, and I think that you saw and heard this from the European leaders who were in Washington yesterday.
Okay, so let's get to the nitty gritty. I mean, Trump says he's trying to arrange a bilateral, and that might lead to a trilateral, and all of these things. But the real issues are security guarantees and land swaps or land forfeiture, however you want to look at this. So, do you think President Zelensky now has accepted the notion. I mean, I'm putting Crimea aside. I don't think that's even in dispute, but that there might have to be some land given that the Russians have not yet physically taken. And can he or will he agree to that and sell it to his population if possible?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there's been talk of that. Donald Trump reiterated these points, that the demands that the maximalist demands that Vladimir Putin posed in Anchorage last week. And so I have no doubt that Ukraine's president he is thinking about these things. I think the Ukrainian government is considering them as well, as are, Ukraine's European allies. Is that acceptable to basically hive away 20% of Ukraine and just hand it over to Russia without Russia giving into any sort of concessions? I don't think so. I don't believe that that's acceptable.
But that's where the security guarantees come in. So I guess I have to ask the two questions at the same time, which is, it's all give and take. So if Ukraine is prepared to give an inch, literally in terms of land, we have been told that, I don't know, I mean, you have to consider the source, that Russia did say they would consider security guarantees in a kind of NATO style, not NATO, but that there would be a presence there. Yeah. Like those two things have to happen simultaneously for each to agree.
Right.
So
yes, I agree. And, having those security guarantees is an important concession if that's really true. But, I've been reading Russian media all through the weekend and today. It doesn't appear that anyone is willing to accept in the Kremlin any sort of security guarantees as they were sort of hinted at yesterday. It doesn't appear that that's on the table at this point, nor does it appear that there's even a bilateral meeting between Putin and Zelenskyy in the cards for the Kremlin. Because I think we have to understand, that what Vladimir Putin's objectives are in all of this. It is to take all of that land, to prolong this war as long as possible, not to give an inch. And so, with everything that's been said over the past weekend, we can't trust Vladimir Putin or Russia to hold to any of those. I wouldn't say that they're commitments that were made or any of the suggestions that they've made so far.
I mean, obviously, Putin is, in my mind, one of the most despicable human beings on the planet. Not sure he is human. I'm not sure there's any blood in those veins at all. As the
I would agree with you.
KGB operative. But as you hinted earlier, and as we've heard from these European leaders and the US, they held back. But I mean, the sanctions are kind of the next step. I mean, they're not going to impose the sanctions now while there's possibilities, while there's hope for a bilateral or these things. But as you cited with the India move, that would have been noticed for sure in the Kremlin.
Yes.
And if Europe gets serious about it, this is the other issue. These European countries that sit at the table also consume Russian energy. And we haven't been actually that helpful with trying to supply other sources. But if sanctions actually came into effect to just keep the pressure on, that might need a week or two till we really see what anybody's prepared to do at this point, right?
Well, I think that those secondary sanctions, the ones that they've announced on India, if we go a little bit further, if the White House goes a bit further, announces the same on China, on Turkey, if Canada, importantly, follows suit with that, as do the Europeans, I think you're going to see the Kremlin react very, very quickly. The Kremlin, Russia has been able to withstand the barrage of sanctions that have been imposed over the past 3.5 years, longer, 2014, in fact.
Because people have circumvented them.
They've been circumvented, absolutely. They've figured out ways to do that, largely through places like India, China, Turkey. But if you start closing those loopholes, start holding those nations to account and the entities that are helping with that circumvention, the Kremlin's gonna feel the pressure, as are those countries. We also have to understand that Russia's economy isn't doing that well. It's completely overheated. It's all based entirely on this war at this point.
Yeah.
Interest rates are around 25, 26%. Inflation is around the same number. I mean, they're not going to be able to sustain this much longer, even with those oil and gas revenues, even if they remain the same. So they really do exclusively rely on those. They've eaten through all of their reserves at this point. I think by some estimations, if they continue to burn at this rate, they will be through all of those reserves by the end of winter next year. And so these oil and gas revenues are really important. So if we can apply pressure on those nations that remain purchasers of them, I do strongly believe that you'll see the Kremlin react quickly. Another point in terms of finances is the 300 billion Canadian dollars that sits in Europe right now. These sovereign Russian reserves. There's been this sort of a little bit of a back and forth as to how Europe might handle this. But if you take that, repurpose that money, hand it over to Ukraine, maybe you term it as reconstruction funds, however you may decide to do
buy
that.
the equipment from the Americans, whatever.
Exactly. That adds additional pressure on the Kremlin. So it is this sort of extreme pressure that's required to get Vladimir Putin to sit at the table, to make those important concessions, and to arrive at that just peace. Just handing over territories or demanding that Zelenskyy hands over this territory is not going to lead to that lasting peace.
No, I don't think. Well, I mean, Donald Trump may have had that notion at one point, but that's from the disastrous meeting. But I don't think anybody thinks this is a one-sided. Look, Putin wouldn't have been in Alaska if he wasn't feeling the heat.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that's due to those secondary sanctions being placed on India. This all came together very quickly.
Yeah.
It was within 48 hours of that announcement. Yeah. And I strongly believe that was the motivating factor here for Putin. So what Donald Trump has to realize is that what he did with those secondary sanctions, it worked. He needs to do more of this. He needs to demonstrate that he is stronger than Vladimir Putin, because that is the only sort of language that Vladimir Putin understands.
Right. But now it's a little bit about process, which is what happened this week had to happen in terms of the public presentation of all of this.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, I think the largest concession I saw out of Trump was, well, not so much a concession, but the Europeans and the Americans, we are not going to decide what Vladimir Zelenskyy can give up. He's got to decide on what the price of peace is. We can't do that. And the president said that clearly. The Europeans said that clearly. So it does kind of now focus on these two guys. Putin and Zelenskyy have to decide what they can do. Maybe not publicly. Pressure can be kept on. But in the end, those two guys have to decide what they're prepared to pay to stop this, if they are.
You're absolutely right. It will come down to that meeting if it does, in fact, ever happen.
Yeah.
I'm not optimistic that it will happen because, look, at the end of the day, Vladimir Putin is not interested in this sort of meeting. What he's interested in is prolonging this thing as long as possible. Because, again, I think it was in July, there were over 5,000 missiles and drones that were dropped onto Ukrainian civilian targets. The morale, the resilience has to eventually break down. And it's through those sorts of tactics.
That's an interesting point because, I mean, of course, he is still trying to get more and more land in Russian control before he really makes some deals, so that he's not talking about 20%, he's talking about 25 or whatever he thinks. And I mean, he wants the whole shebang anyway, and maybe 8 other countries. So but so that's his grandiose view is I want the USSR, back in as it was in the good old days, from his point of view. But that is not going to happen. His economy, as you say, is in trouble. He's burning through soldiers of his own and borrowed from China and North Korea and everywhere else. And the specter of sanctions are there. So I mean, he's got a timeline too that is closing in on him a bit, seeing what happened in with the India situation.
Yeah, he hasn't been feeling it though. That's the problem.
Okay.
He's burning through. I mean, he's gone through 1 million people, a
Yeah.
million soldiers during the
Stunning.
course of this war. It's unthinkable. I mean,
Yeah.
you can't even, if you say that number, I mean, it's abstract. You can't understand how this is possible. Vladimir Putin doesn't care. He
Yeah.
doesn't
He does.
place any sort of value on human life.
Yeah.
He doesn't care about how this is all impacting the average Russian. What he cares about is just staying in power. And this war is central to that. That is his timeline. He wants to remain in power for as long as possible, consolidate power. That's why he started this war. That's why he's still in this war, because it is helping him to remain in power. And so the only thing that is going to throw him off of this objective of staying in power and keeping this war going is external pressure. And that's where these Indian sanctions, it worked, because it exposed a part of his strategy, a weakness within his strategy, and that's why he reacted. So we need to learn from this lesson and continue putting on maximum pressure, even though these discussions are happening, these meetings are happening. It's only with that pressure that we're going to get him to back off and actually concede anything in this process.
So give him a week or two where he finally says, for once and for all, no, there can't be any NATO troops anywhere near any border, not NATO-like troops. Let me be clear, because it's not NATO. No, no Europeans or Americans anywhere. And therefore, there's going to be no meeting with Zelensky, and we're just going to fight, fight, fight.
That's what's going to happen anyway. We have to
Yeah.
accept that.
So then that's when the West reacts in Europe and starts to really tighten the noose in terms of the sanctions and maybe stationing people around his borders any which way.
I would say quietly start doing it now. I mean, the way that
Yeah.
those India secondary tariffs were done, it was done quietly. There was little
Yeah.
fanfare. Over the weekend, when the summit was happening in Alaska, I didn't hear anyone really talking about it,
No,
but
no, no.
it was a very important piece of all of this that's been happening. So you can continue doing this, doing it quietly. Imposing secondary sanctions on various different sectors,
Yeah.
companies that are supplying, Russia with parts for drones, and specifically China, for example. You can start doing this quietly, sending those signals to Putin that we mean business.
Now, Mr. Zelensky, this is President Zelensky. He's the guy who we're seeing a shift in the polls. I think it's now about 2/3 of Ukrainians are saying, let's give up some land in the pursuit of peace. Let's just do it. Because to your point, there's no stopping Putin any way you look at it. He'll keep going until every Russian is dead, and unless it's his mother, and then he might not care even about that. Um, so what does he do now in the short term? Does he have to start really talking to his population about what the parameters of that might be, like what land goes? Haven't most people agreed that Crimea is gone any which way?
I don't know. I don't think so. If you speak to Ukrainians,
Okay.
it's still part of Ukraine as far as they're concerned. I think the best case scenario here right now, for Ukraine is a ceasefire, a freezing of the front lines, and then taking it from there and seeing where it goes. I don't think that you're going to see any sort of full-fledged peace,
No.
or any sort of agreement between Ukraine and Russia, so long as Russia occupies these territories. With that ceasefire, you will have a policy of non-recognition of the Russian occupation of Crimea and the four other territories in Donbass. And I suspect that that will, remain effective for quite a long time. But even if we achieve that sort of ceasefire, I don't think we'll get a peace. We need to make sure that Ukraine is able to rearm itself, because that's exactly what Russia will be doing.
Yeah, that's exactly the problem with ceasefires, is everybody just goes home and builds up the troops, right?
Right. And I mean, one of the concessions that we heard Donald Trump talk about is that Russia would be pressured to signing some sort of an agreement that it would never attack its neighbors again. I mean, this is like a childish fantasy. I mean, yeah. Russia doesn't respect any of the treaties it ever signs, and it hasn't done so for the past century.
Including on Ukraine.
Including Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, it was given this guarantee by Russia that it would never violate Ukraine's borders. It did. And that's, we just have to accept that so long as Vladimir Putin and his ilk are running Russia, they will try to do this. They will continue to violate the borders of their neighbors, including Canada and the Arctic, I might add. And just
I want to ask you about that, because there's been some reporting on that this week, that China and Russia are really using this distraction, right? The other conversations to really hunker down in the Arctic and solidify their base there, to the exclusion of us and everybody else. And we've been way too friendly in terms of letting them in and establishing that base.
Senator, how long ago were you and I talking about the threat to our Arctic? And Russia, it's not like Russia's been hiding their intentions in the Arctic.
Nor China.
They have militarized the Arctic over the past 20 years. They've built 26 new bases or refurbished bases, all with offensive capabilities. They've been building Arctic super weapons, torpedoes that are armed with nuclear weapons, high-speed torpedoes. And the intention of that is to basically fire them at Arctic coastlines to travel underneath the ice. And they've also made these maximalist claims on the Arctic. They have claimed all of the resources underneath the Arctic Sea, right up to our 200-mile economic exclusive zone. So that means right up to Canada's border.
And he doesn't care. He pierces the border every day with his flights, right?
Well, exactly. And they've also claimed, the Russian Foreign Ministry in their 2030 Arctic strategy document basically outlined the fact that there is going to be a conflict in the Arctic sometime in the next few years, and that Russia needs to prepare for this conflict. And in fact, just about a month ago, the Russian ambassador to Canada put out a tweet saying that Canada is colluding with our Arctic allies, Sweden and Finland, to actually instigate some sort of a conflict in the Arctic. So the same sort of language that was being used by Russia about Ukraine and NATO, about some sort of imaginary threat that they posed, they're using that same language about us in the Arctic, which tells me, along with all this other stuff, that Russia is preparing for a conflict in the Arctic, and the sovereignty of our Arctic is at threat right now.
1,000%. I don't know. We'll wait. We'll see if there's some response from a new and different government, but we're still
there
waiting.
is. I mean, just today there was an announcement that Canada had signed a strategic defense and security treaty with Finland, which is very much welcome, because they face similar threats, and there's a lot that we can actually learn from the Finns. And in terms of procurement of icebreakers and that sort of Arctic defense technology, Finland has it. And so if we can work together with them, I think this is a very positive turn of events, and another sort of agreement that will send a strong signal to Moscow that we are working together and that we are unified.
And they're very much at the table because they get it, because they're on the border. Let me just wrap up here today with and it's kind of getting the cart before the horse, but there is discussions of some North and South Korea style, troops on the border. Some people have even talked about, the Polish folk, they're building their own border wall.
Yeah.
Would trap tanks and do all sorts of things there. There's the extreme version, which is what we all agreed to. Well, not we, but what was agreed to in Hong Kong, which is let the Chinese be in control, but they had to leave it alone for 50 years. You know, there are templates out there, none of them great. Um, what do you think is sort of the most reasonable on that list if we ever got to that place?
Well, again, I think it's probably at this point it's a ceasefire, a ceasefire perhaps that is enforced by Western allies, at least on the Ukrainian side. I think that right now is the best case scenario. I don't think that Putin would agree to that. I think he convinced. I think Donald Trump sort of was weighing that, but whatever was said in the car on the way to the summit and whatever was said behind closed doors, it seemed that Trump now is convinced that a peace deal is what should be the objective in all this. I just don't think that that's achievable at this point. So having that ceasefire, I think that's really key. And also working with our NATO allies, making sure that their defenses are as robust as possible. That means, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, as you mentioned, Finland as well. I mean, these are all countries with borders that to border Russia. And so making sure that they have all that they need. We have boots on the ground in Latvia, making sure that, we don't waver from that position, that we strengthen that position and work with the Latvians to make sure that that when Vladimir Putin looks at that border, he doesn't see an area that might be exposed where he might try this again.
This is a flyer at the end here, but I was interested in Melania Trump sending the letter and then Mrs. Zelenskyy sending the letter back about the kids. It seems to be if Putin actually returned some of the Ukrainian kids that they've stolen,
over 20,000. Yeah.
Over 20. If there was some movement there, he would buy himself a little bit of time and goodwill for sure, because that would be a signal. I'm not sure he's even capable of that. Do you see anything behind that at all?
I think that the First Lady is clearly personally concerned about this. How couldn't you be? I mean, these are the 20,000 kids. The reports are that the vast majority of them have spent significant amounts of time in basically re-education concentration camps in Russia. Many of them have been brainwashed to send back to fight against their own countrymen. Yeah. The stories that you hear about the conditions at some of these camps are horrific. And so the fact that the First Lady has sort of paid attention to this is making this an issue, and writing back and forth with the First Lady of Ukraine, I think is significant. And I think that that Melania Trump does have influence with her husband. And so we should be keeping an eye on all this, because I think that Donald Trump could be influenced by his wife in a very positive way.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with that. Well, Marcus, I'm sure we'll talk again pretty soon to see what happens in the next 24 hours or 2 weeks. Like we're in a crucial time now of there'll be some smoke signals sent up one way or the other. I don't know whether we'll get the puff of white smoke or not, but there has to be some indications, I'd say, in the next few days that there's either going to be that bilateral meeting or there's not, and then that will trigger other things like the sanctions, and so it could be as short as sort of 48 hours, I guess.
Could be. Yeah. Let's just keep our fingers crossed that this all works out for Ukraine, and that the killing of those civilians, it stops.
Can just stop. Marcus, thank you very much for joining us today, and really appreciate your analysis on this, as it's still so fluid. Marcus Kolga, he's an expert on Russia and Eastern European. He created a body called Disinfo Watch to really try and sort the lies and the propaganda from the truth in the region, and also works as a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So we always appreciate your views. Thanks so much. We'll see you soon. And that's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. We'll talk again very soon.